Hello everyone. My name is Jorge Almazan from the University of Keio. Although I was in this university in 2008, long time ago, but a very intense time.
Yep.
And
I was partnering with him on the studio 8 years ago, and now we're back here together. I'm Sanki Choe from University of Seoul. And today we're going to present this studio, a co-studio by Keio University and University of Seoul together. So we'll just switch back and forth to the old mandam style, because that's popular in Japan as well.
Manzai in Japanese.
Manzai or mandam, okay. Okay, so let's see now. We chose the title Traversal City because when we looked at Dongdaemun, we conceived it as many layers of linear boundaries and linear layers. So we thought traversing the layers as tactics for exploring the city. And traversing applies not only to traversing the physical boundaries, but also to more like social and environmental layers as well. So we have 58 slides, and you're giving us what, 15 minutes or 20 minutes? 20 minutes? Okay, so for 20 minutes we've prepared 60 slides. That means we are still brainstorming, right? So let's see how it goes. Okay, next. We spent the past 3 weeks of intense research and fieldwork. We all went out there as urban explorers and gathered the specimen from the city, and now we are at a point trying to make some sense of it, connect the dots. And the students are from Tokyo, Seoul, and Singapore, and apparently those 3 cities are the cities that are mostly familiar with urban intensity and the density, as well as the megastructures and all the public-private tensions going on. So we got some kind of advantage in the start, but that didn't really work as an advantage at some point, because we didn't really see things with fresh eyes. But having many foreigners come to Seoul and look at the city actually helped us bring some to look at it with fresh eyes. Next. So when we look at Dongdaemun and the map that actually the one John showed us earlier, if you look at it, the Dongdaemun area is almost empty from the old maps, which means right now, compared to areas around Dongdaemun and the Dongdaemun Wholesale District, where most of the surrounding areas are quite dense, and it has the existing urban fabric, well connected. The area that we are in searching for is mostly it's supposed to be the largest wholesale fashion district in Asia, and you can see it almost like an archipelago of megastructures. So it's probably conceived with the top-down development model and the 20th century principle of traffic-oriented efficiency, which somehow is failing at this time. Next. And when you look at the area, a particular building caught our attention, which is the Pyeonghwa Market, the linear structure, which sometimes appears as a wall, but then it has this visual metaphor of becoming a possible connector. So it was also historically and symbolically important, because it's the first so-called content architecture that populated the area and started all the wholesale market. And the content architecture we're going to explain a little later. Next. Okay, so that was the introduction. I'm going to show, divide it into 3 parts: the past, present, and the future. So the past is more about a critique on the historical analysis, and the second part will be more of a analysis that happens due to the imminent problems that are in the site. Here you see Cheonggyecheon from 1950s, 60s, and 70s, respectively. Next. And it all developed with some kind of a promise on unlimited horizontal expansion. And you can see that it created many layers horizontally and also vertically. So there are horizontal layers and vertical layers that expanded the existing market to unlimited possibility. Next. And Pyeonghwa-시장 from the early 60s is probably the typical content architecture that both Jorge and I are very fascinated about. It's basically a building that is a structure. It's more like an infrastructure where it can be filled in with, not designed for any specific programs, but is there to provide space for whatever programs to come in. And as you can see from this old Pyeonghwa-시장 building, if you compare it with what it is now, you can see that the windows are much larger. It only shows the frames. So it's basically a frame and infill structure. That's how we understood the nature of this building. Next. And it being a frame and infill means that it can be filled up with anything. And at that time, there were many things happening commonly in that site. Fabrication, living quarters, sweatshops, and they also utilized mezzanine to maximize even further the total area they can use. Next. And it was conceived with a horizontal expansion. If you see on the top left, that's the traditional one-level market structure. And when they were given this chance to populate this frame and infill, what they chose was to just multiply it, duplicate it, and then stack it on one top of each other. So what happened is it may have multiplied the market area, but the opportunity for this vertical connection was lost from the beginning. Next. So what then happened is because the market structure has gone up, elevated, and duplicated, now the interior corridor has become the shop front. Next. And the exterior surface became the back of house. Next. And because the exterior became the back of house, now all the windows are not needed. You would block up all the windows to allow more merchandise display space that faces the interior corridor. So the windows are not really necessary at this time. You will see all the windows blocked, and then they will turn on the lights even in the daytime. Next. So basically, this content architecture became a wholesale warehouse. It's a warehouse where it has a 600-meter long corridor, only 90 centimeters wide. You can see it by that yellow line that demarcates the boundary where they're not supposed to intrude into. Like even on that sign on the ceiling, it says "Son, son, son, line, line, line." Please abide by the line and don't put any stuff into the public space, so-called. Yeah, so there's this kind of tension, and it's just the main it's the only circulation in that building which continues 600 meters straight shot, and there are very little chances to get out from that racing track. Next. So it's basically a tunnel structure, as you can see. Next. And because this became a wholesale warehouse, all the other functions that used to be populating this building, such as food or like even for the wholesale industry, they had fabrication, they had resting places, they had design shops, and they had material sectors. They were all now outsourced. Now this is just a wholesale market. I'm calling this a warehouse because it really looks like a warehouse, but the wholesale activities happen in the area. Next. And what's even more separating the building from the others is not just the outsourcing of functions, but also the linear separations that's around. It's even more intensified by layers of sidewalk, stream, another sidewalk, a barrier, a wall, and then a regular road, a service road, a facade, and then two interior corridors and another facade. So it's just almost like a barcode if you look at it. It's just layers of lines that block any kind of traverse movement into the north-south direction. Next. So we go on to the second part where we now, depending on that first analysis of the historical development, we want to look at what's really happening now due to the changes that are quite imminent in the present. Next. So one of the imminent challenges that we're facing in the area is that they took away the highway, which you saw on the old photograph, and then they reopened up Cheonggyecheon stream. Well, it reintroduced the public activity into this otherwise very isolated archipelago of warehouses. And now, even with the public activity introduced, it is still isolated in a linear form because of the sectional differences that you just cannot climb over that wall. And just like Pyeonghwa-Sijang corridor, we were walking with the students from one end, hey, let's just look at the stream, enjoy some nature, and then you couldn't get out. Once you're down there, it's like a trench. You cannot get out until you walk 600 meters, same length as the Pyeonghwa-Sijang. It was just impossible. So you can see that this kind of new public space introduced adjacent to it is not really connecting with the rest of the Pyeonghwa-Sijang structure. So another traversal movement is probably needed here. Next. Another imminent challenge that we're facing is not just for Dongdaemun area, it's basically for all Seoul. And I think we experienced this bad air quality in the early months of this year. You know, there was this public scare about fine dust, micro dust, and then people were scared to go out. They were scared to open the windows even in hot days. And then this summer we had this record hot summer since 1984. So in 22 years, everyone was turning on the air conditioner, shutting the windows, blocking themselves from any exterior contact. So that's really driving the people more indoors, which means the public activities are also invading the interior space. And then how does that relate to these archipelago of warehouses that we have in the Dongdaemun area? That's another challenge that we want to address. Next. And also, due to the record hot summer, now the store started to open up the storefront, and then there was this big thing about wasting air conditioner, wasting energy. But the shop owners were actually protesting because they say that was the only way to connect to the consumers and the public. So they were really saying, if you cut the energy, if you don't let us waste energy, then we're all gonna die. So there was this kind of implies some kind of atmospheric connection can become a commodity. And then sometimes this atmospheric connection can be even stronger than the visual connection itself. Next. Another imminent challenge that we want to address is the active tourism in the area. So this active tourism, as you can see with the tourists, you can see at night they all bring this carriers and stuff it with they use the whole night to stuff their carriers and then leave in the morning. So the tourist activities are actually introducing retail into this otherwise wholesale district. Next. And another imminent challenge is that there used to be a traditional time division, say wholesale happens at night from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and then retail should happen on the daytime. Now that is kind of changing because as you can see here, he's suggesting like a Cinderella sale at 12 o'clock. And then now it's not just the retail, it's the duty-free shops that operate night duty-free shops. And as he suggests, the market can run 24 hours, no matter it's day or night, and who can refuse to that face, right? Next. And the imminent challenges, because the stores are running 24 hours, the shop owners are also running 24 hours. So usually in the old days, they would come at 10 p.m., open the wholesale, deal with the consumers coming from the regions and closing the door around 6, 7 a.m. But now at 6 a.m., they have to change their business and start addressing the retail consumers. So the only time they get rest is from 6 p.m. till 10 p.m. So 4 hours they go home to rest because there is no area around here to really take any small naps. Next. So probably the last one I'm going to address about the imminent changes are the internet shopping that kind of creates a new breed of jobs in the area. You will see these guys running around with plastic bags if you go there from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And next. They are called 사입자 or 사입 삼촌, meaning buyer uncle, because they're usually young, healthy men, and you can easily identify them by the cross bags and the earphones that connect to their smartphones, where they get their orders from internet buyers on the remote region. So they are buying for them and then transporting it for them, and then they also carry this plastic tapes on their wrists, so they can always wrap up, and they never stop. They just run around. They never use the escalator because they prefer the stairs better. They even don't want the waiting time to take away their job. So it's next. And the paths of those 사입 삼촌s are quite interesting because they traverse through more freely from any architectural restraints. And it's a perfect example of how this non-architectural auxiliary network can cover up for what architecture fails to provide. I mean, there are many examples like this in Korea. It's not just them, but imagine valet parking. They provide service for what the city doesn't provide, and even like food delivery and that. So that's not a new phenomenon in Korea. Next. There are other means of auxiliary transportation, like the 지게꾼. They're the ones they specialize in the vertical transportation, because 평화시장 is all kind of stacked up 3 layers. There is no real vertical connection, so it's really up to them to operate the building. Next. That's the route of the 지게꾼s. Next. And then there are networks for the trucks, small trucks loading and unloading in the street. Next. And then many motorcycles and carts that move around and operate the building. So next, I think, do you want to probably take over from here?
Okay, I think it's next one.
Yeah. Oh, next.
Next.
Okay.
So given this situation, the next step for us, especially kind of mobilizing this fresh view from, especially maybe from my students, who some of them was the first time that they came to Korea, was like what kind of suggestions we can find in order to give kind of a response to this situation in Pyeonghwa Sijan, in Pyeonghwa market, which is kind of an excuse of other situations which are also happening in other areas. So one thing is about the issue of smallness. I think the Dongdaemun now is really about bigness in a sense. So this is a kind of, and there is a whole theory of bigness related to Kolkhas and to the neoliberal city. So I think from my point of view, what we can find not in Dongdaemun but in the areas around Dongdaemun is this issue of, let's say, maybe some people could say it as a pre-modern condition, but I would say it's an opportunity as a critique of a neoliberal city. John mentioned the functionalist city, but I think the functional city is already over. I think what we are confronting now in cities like Seoul, in cities like Tokyo, very clearly in Tokyo, very aggressively in Tokyo especially, is the neoliberal urbanism. And I think the small scale existence there could be a suggestion that we could mobilize and kind of use in order to suggest future scenarios. Please, second. Next. And the other one is the presence of expandable interfaces. Instead of having that kind of introverted interfaces, we can see that in Seoul, in Korea, there is a very kind of soft interface between public and private that can be adapted to winter, to summer, to rain. This was a rainy day, but it was still open. So we see this flexibility, which might not kind of fit with our aesthetic values, but at the end is very dynamic, very intense. Next. We also found, it seems that it's not so traditional, but we found just randomly, like a kind of in a derive through Seoul, this kind of reverse boundaries in which what should be in this case is a bar counter, which should be usually in the interior space. Now it was reversed. And you see this was 2 days ago, it was quite rainy, but still the people were there. So it's a kind of acceptance and enjoyment of outside conditions, even if they are not completely perfect in terms of let's say, traditional comfort. Next. Also, we found something which doesn't exist in Tokyo, which is the elevated open terraces. It seems that it's now quite fashionable. It's a kind of a new phenomenon, but even if this was, again, as you can see in the floor, a rainy day, even if it's rainy, even if it's not perfectly comfortable, people want to be outside. People want to stay outside. So I think this is a force, this is a kind of, a tendency that we can use and mobilize in order to kind of confront this tendency towards the monolith that John was mentioning, the introverted monolith. Next. Also, the fact that the design of the facade, in a sense, if we can call this a facade, is created by the contents of the shops. I think this is a very intense, vibrant kind of design facade. Next one. Sometimes it was houseware there. This is records. It's a facade full of vinyl records, very kind of beautiful. Next. And also we can see as a kind of maybe let's say in terms of economy a kind of alternative to this top-down liberal or neoliberal structure, pyramidal structure, big companies. We can see that this area coming from Nandaemun to all the way to Dongdaemun, that there is a kind of sense of co-petition, this word that mixes competition and cooperation. So they can you go the next one? You can see that there are clusters of activities like needlework, vegetable and fish, textiles, all of small shops run by individuals which are clustered, and by being clustered and maybe acting as a dynamic swarm, as John was mentioning, they survive in a very interesting and definitely very kind of surprising way. I think this kind of atmosphere is, at least for people from outside, is quite surprising and interesting. Next. We can see that also facades sometimes are just the activities. They are people that put all the activities outside. This, in this case, might for some people look a little bit chaotic or whatever, but at the end is this concept of not having putting the backstage in the front and putting the activities in the front. Next. Also, we found very interesting that, for example, some people could have lunch in the same place as the shop. This is something that maybe is difficult to find in Europe, maybe difficult to find in Japan, but nevertheless, I think it adds certain level of everyday liveness, which is now kind of pretty much appreciated by tourists, because you don't want to go to tourist places, you want to go to a place where you can really enjoy and maybe take part, experience the everyday life. So we saw that this proper bibimbap there, so it's not like a fast sandwich, it's proper food taken there, but probably certain networks of people who are bringing those foods. Next. Yes, so I think basically that was some ideas of how we can mobilize the phenomena happening around into the site.
Yeah. Can we go like 5 more minutes? Okay, all right. Oh, okay. All right, so I'll just some more explorations, but we'll go fast. Okay, then we looked at some inhabitable linear boundaries where boundaries are never two-dimensional, but it can be a volume and start to be inhabited with functions. Next. You can see them inside the market, this market where they are reintroducing the kitchenette and the sink. It's kind of coming back to an otherwise very homogeneous warehouse. Next. So the surface becomes a volume, and it gives us an opportunity to produce a transitional space that can interact with public activities. Next. And then there are more traversal connections introduced by retail coming into the wholesale, and then suddenly they start to open up the doors leading into the building where it was not possible before. So next, so we came up with this kind of, we're still working on this kind of a diagram where traversal connections can actually start to infiltrate into the monotonous tunnel. Next. And then because of introducing this retail, we have a more extreme display where the display surfaces go extreme with small module, and then it utilizes the sectional differences, like one in the ceiling and then under the seats. Next. We're mapping those extreme displays. Next. Then we talked about porous boundaries. Next. Next. Okay, so this will be fast. I only have 5 more here. Yeah. So we don't have that much on this last sequence because we're still working on it, and I think this will eventually unfold into our final production, whether it has to be a design work or an installation, or it can be just a collection of images. We don't know what it's going to be, but we want to address this in this manner. Next. Well, we're looking at Pyeongwashijang as right now, it's one of the most unpopular markets. It was the first market that generated all the 신평화시장, 동평화시장, 남평화시장, 청평화시장, but then now it's really declining. And it's partly because of the architectural limitations. Next. And then we are mapping the activity of tourism, and there could be some kind of a common shared between this tourism and wholesale, which starts to break up that strong surface. Next. And then there are also these pedestrian activities introduced by Cheonggyecheon, and also some parks around it that can also bring in some shared commons in the boundaries of the building. Next. And then the cultural activities that are planned for these areas by the Seoul city, I think they can also become a catalyst for reopening up this market. Next. So this is the last sheet. I'm suggesting these kind of crossings, traversal crossings, that start to infiltrate into the building and then produce transitional spaces that are not just transitional in terms of function, but also in terms of atmospheric connections, and it could reintroduce more vital elements. One last thing that we want to keep in mind as a mantra for this studio is that we don't want to destroy, we don't want to kill the wholesale, we don't want to replace the wholesale with something else, because wholesale in the market is the pure, and as we saw in Jorge's explanation about the smallness, probably it's the, we don't want this to be like Uniqlo, right? You know, the beauty is here is that all these small shops, there are 3,000 shops where 2,800 are privately owned, and that's the kind of beauty here with this collectiveness and this possibility for proposing a common that is neither capitalistic nor social, or it can be more of a something shared in between. All right.